I've been a Crown prosecutor in the Ontario Superior Court of Justice for 11 years. I've seen arrogance walk through a courtroom door more times than I can count, wearing expensive suits, trailing junior lawyers, moving through the world like the rules were written for other people. I thought I'd stopped being surprised by it. I was wrong. My wife, Claire, has been a kindergarten teacher at Ridgemont Elementary in Mississauga for 9 years. She loves her job the way some people love breathing, not because it's impressive, not because it pays well. It doesn't, but because she genuinely cannot imagine doing anything else. She talks about her students at dinner. She buys supplies with her own money. In October, she strings paper leaves along the classroom windows, and in February she cuts out little red hearts and writes each child's name by hand. She is the kind of person who makes the world quieter and steadier just by being in it. She was 34 years old that September, 7 months along with our first child, still going into school every day because she'd asked to, because she wanted to finish the first term with her class, because she felt fine, and her doctor said it was her choice. People at school fussed over her. Parents brought her tea. Her principal, a woman named Margaret, had quietly rearranged the schedule, so Claire never had yard duty in the cold. I was at the courthouse when it happened. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September, and I was preparing closing arguments for a fraud case that had been running 6 weeks. My phone was face down on my desk. I didn't feel it vibrate. The call came from the school's main office line. When I finally saw it and called back, it was Margaret who answered, and she told me in a careful, controlled voice that there had been an incident, that Claire was fine, that the paramedics had cleared her, but that I should come. That word incident is the kind of word adults use when the real word is too ugly to say out loud. Claire was sitting in the staff room when I arrived. One of the other teachers, a young woman named Priya, had her hand on Claire's back and looked up at me with an expression I recognized from victim interviews. That particular mix of anger and helplessness that settles on a person's face when they've witnessed something they couldn't stop. My wife's right cheek was still faintly red. She looked at me and didn't say anything for a moment, and I crossed the room and crouched in front of her and took her hands, and she said very quietly, "The baby's fine. They checked. Everything's fine." I said, "Tell me what happened." She told me. There was a parent. His name, I would learn later, was Brendan Voss. He had a son in Claire's class, a boy named Carter, who had started the year with some difficulty adjusting to the routine, some conflict with other children. Nothing unusual for a 5-year-old in his first month of school. Claire had sent home a note 2 weeks earlier, the kind of gentle, professional communication she'd written 100 times, suggesting a short meeting to talk about how Carter was settling in and whether there was anything useful she should know about his home routine. Brendan Voss had not responded to that note. He had, however, shown up that Tuesday afternoon at dismissal time, in the hallway outside Claire's classroom, while the children were still being collected. He was a large man, well-dressed, with the particular bearing of someone who had never been told to wait. Claire had been walking a child to his grandmother near the door when Voss stepped directly into her path. He told her, in front of the remaining children and 2 other parents, that her note had been condescending, that he didn't need some underpaid babysitter telling him how to raise his son, that if she had a problem with Carter, she should deal with it, because that was what she was paid for. Claire, who is 7 months pregnant and still the most composed person I have ever met, told him calmly that she would be happy to schedule a meeting and that the note had been routine, sent to every family in the class. He told her she was lying, and then, before anyone in that hallway moved or spoke, he raised his open hand and slapped her across the face. The sound was sharp enough that a child at the back of the hallway started crying. No one stepped forward. There were 3 parents within 10 feet, 2 of them adults larger than Voss, and not one of them moved. Not immediately. The whole corridor went still in the way that only shock produces that sudden suspension where the brain hasn't yet caught up to what the eyes just saw. Voss looked at my wife, and then he turned and walked out of the school. He was already in his car when the first parent thought to move toward Claire. She told me this in the staff room, still holding my hands, speaking steadily, watching my face. I know my face. I have spent 11 years learning to keep it neutral in front of juries, witnesses, judges. I don't know what she saw in it in that moment. I asked her one question. I said, "What's his last name?" She said, "Thomas." "Please don't." I said, "I'm not going to do anything tonight. I promise." That was the first true thing I'd said in the last 5 minutes. I was not going to do anything that night. What I was going to do required several days and a great deal of patience, and patience is something the law has made me very good at. We went to the hospital first, not because Claire was frightened, but because I needed to see the numbers on a monitor with my own eyes. Our son's heartbeat steady, unhurried, indifferent to the ugliness of that afternoon appeared on the screen, and I sat in the plastic chair beside my wife's bed and breathed for what felt like the first time in an hour. The attending physician, a calm woman named Dr. Oluwasun, told us both clearly that everything looked normal, that Claire should rest, that any concerning symptoms, cramping, reduced movement, anything should bring her straight back. She patted Claire's hand. She gave me a look that I understood. We drove home. Claire slept. I didn't. I want to explain something about what it means to know the law well. People imagine that someone in my position would reach for the dramatic response, the confrontation, the threat, the moment of visible dominance. That is what people picture. That is, frankly, what Brendan Voss would have assumed if he had spared a moment to wonder what happened after he walked out of that school. He had not spared that moment. I was fairly certain of that. Men like Voss rarely do. What I actually did, sitting at my kitchen table at 2 a.m. with a cold cup of coffee and my laptop, was begin to think carefully about Brendan Voss, the way I think about every case before I take it to trial. Methodically, without emotion, or at least with emotion, set aside in the compartment where it belongs. By morning I had a name, an address in Port Credit, a LinkedIn profile that told me he was the co-founder and managing director of a private real estate development company called Northfield Capital Group, and a business registration that showed Northfield had been incorporated 9 years ago with a second partner who had, notably, left the company 4 years later. I noted that departing partners sometimes have things to say. I also had a daughter, a memory actually, my colleague at the Crown's office, a woman named Diane who had spent 3 years in the financial crimes unit before moving to organized crime, had mentioned Northfield Capital at a department barbecue the previous summer. I hadn't registered it at the time. People mentioned companies. I'd been focused on the potato salad. I called Diane at 7:30 in the morning. She answered on the second ring, which told me she was already at her desk, which was not surprising because Diane is always already at her desk. I told her I had a personal matter and needed to know what she knew about Northfield Capital Group. There was a pause. She said, "How personal?" I said, "My wife." Another pause, shorter. "Diane is quick." She said, "Come in early. Use the side door." What Diane told me over the next 40 minutes, with files spread across her desk and her door closed, rearranged the picture considerably. Northfield Capital had been under informal scrutiny for 2 years. Nothing charged, nothing public, because financial crimes take time, and the evidence had been building slowly, and there were jurisdictional questions about whether this was a provincial matter or whether it needed federal involvement. What Diane's former colleagues had assembled was a pattern. Northfield had been selling pre-construction condo units to individual investors, collecting deposits of $40,000 to $80,000 per unit, and then restructuring the projects midway through development in ways that conveniently eliminated investor protections. Some units were resold. Some projects were quietly folded into new holding companies. The original investors were left holding worthless contracts and no legal recourse because the restructuring had been done just carefully enough to stay on the right side of the line. 42 investors over 3 years. Most of them ordinary people, a retired teacher from Hamilton who'd put in $60,000 from her pension, a young couple from Brampton who'd used their entire first home savings, a widower from Oakville who'd believed he was securing something for his children. The reason nothing had been charged yet was evidence. The paper trail was careful. Voss had good lawyers, and he knew how to structure things. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that the retiring partner, a man named Dennis Choi, had kept copies of everything. He'd kept them because he'd left precisely because he was uncomfortable with what Voss was doing, and he'd kept them because he'd spoken to a lawyer who told him to. Those copies were in a secure location. Choi had been waiting, his lawyer had told Diane's colleague, for someone to ask the right questions in the right way. I am very good at asking the right questions. This is the part where I want to be precise, because I've seen enough of the justice system to know how it gets distorted in the telling. I did not misuse my position. I did not make calls I wasn't entitled to make. What I did was contact the lead investigator on the Northfield file, a detective named Ray Fonseca, at the Ontario Provincial Police's Financial Crimes Unit, and tell him that I had, as a private citizen, information relevant to a potential witness in his investigation, and that I believed I could facilitate an introduction if he was interested. He was interested. I also filed a police report on behalf of my wife that same morning, documenting the assault in the school hallway, providing the names of the 3 parents who had been present, and noting that there was security camera footage in the school's main corridor. That report was straightforward and required nothing from my position except the knowledge that it needed to be filed completely and correctly the first time. Margaret, Claire's principal, had already called the school board. The board had already notified their legal department. By Wednesday evening, Brendan Voss had received a formal letter informing him that he was banned from Ridgemont Elementary property and that a no-contact order was being sought. He had also, I learned from Diane on Thursday morning, received a phone call from Detective Fonseca. I've imagined that phone call. I've tried to be honest with myself about whether there's satisfaction in it, and I'll admit there is. Not pride, something quieter than pride. The particular relief of a mechanism working the way it was designed to work. Voss hired 2 lawyers within 24 hours of Fonseca's call. This, as it turned out, was exactly the wrong move, because the specific lawyers he hired were a corporate firm with a conflict of interest he hadn't noticed, and by the time the conflict was identified, 4 more days had passed and Dennis Choi had sat down with investigators and begun to talk. Choi talked for 6 hours. What he provided wasn't just copies of documents, it was context. It was the internal emails that explained what the restructurings were designed to do. It was the meeting notes from conversations where Voss had been explicit about what he intended. It was the record of Choi raising objections and being told, in writing, to focus on his own file. The charge came down on a Friday morning in early November, 6 weeks after my wife stood in that school hallway with her hand pressed to her cheek. Brendan Voss was charged with fraud over $5,000, 38 counts, 1 for each investor transaction that could be clearly documented. The aggregate value exceeded $2.3 million. He was also charged with simple assault for the incident at Ridgemont Elementary. This charge was smaller. It carried a maximum of 5 years. It would, in the usual course of things, have been the less significant matter. But I had pushed for it to be filed fully and correctly, and it was, and it would stand alongside the fraud charges in every court document and every public record going forward. I was not the prosecutor on his case. That would have been inappropriate, and I had made clear from the beginning that I was operating as a private citizen in everything related to Voss personally. The Crown's office assigned the file to a colleague I trust, a careful, experienced lawyer named Andrea, who does not lose cases she should win. I watched the bail hearing from the public gallery. Voss came in wearing a suit that probably cost more than most of his investors had lost in any single unit. He had a new legal team better than the first ones. He was granted bail with conditions: no contact with investors or witnesses, passport surrendered, reporting requirements. He looked across the courtroom at one point with the particular expression of a man who cannot quite believe the world has organized itself around holding him accountable. I know that expression. I've watched it shift, over the course of a trial, into something else, something quieter and smaller. I left before he could see me. Claire stopped going into school at the end of October, not because she was forced to, but because she finally agreed it was time. She spent the last weeks of her pregnancy reading and walking slowly around our neighborhood and video calling her students on Friday afternoons, which Margaret had arranged because it was, as Margaret put it, good for the children's emotional development and absolutely not, because their teacher missed them terribly. Our son was born on a Thursday morning in late November, 7 pounds 4 ounces. The labor was long, and Claire was remarkable throughout it, in the way she is remarkable at everything steadily, quietly, without making a performance of the difficulty. I held him in the delivery room and felt something I don't have good language for. Not relief, exactly, though relief was part of it. Not joy, though that was there too. Something more like the settling of a weight I hadn't known I'd been carrying since that Tuesday in September. A weight that had been sitting just behind my sternum for 8 weeks, and that lifted, in that moment, completely. We named him Daniel Owen Carver. He has Claire's eyes and, the nurses said approvingly, very good lungs. The trial of Brendan Voss began 14 months after the charges were laid. It ran for 3 weeks. I attended when my schedule allowed, sitting in the public gallery, watching Andrea work. She was excellent. The fraud case was built carefully and presented clearly. Choi testified for 2 days. The 42 investors, or their representatives, in the cases where investors had since died, filed victim impact statements. The retired teacher from Hamilton sat in that witness box and described what the loss of $60,000 had meant to her retirement, and the courtroom was very quiet while she spoke. Voss's defense argued, as defenses in these cases do, that the restructurings were legitimate business decisions made in good faith, that the losses were the result of market conditions, that the contracts had contained disclosure language that sophisticated investors should have understood. Andrea dismantled each argument patiently and completely. The assault charge was addressed in a single morning. There were 3 witnesses, security camera footage, and a medical record from the school's first aid log. It took approximately 4 hours to establish and prove what had happened in that hallway. Voss was convicted on 36 of the 38 fraud counts and on the assault charge. He was sentenced on a Tuesday morning in the spring. I know this because I had blocked it in my calendar months in advance. The sentencing judge, a woman with 30 years on the bench whose demeanor I would describe as methodically unimpressed by everyone, reviewed the victim impact statements, the financial totals, the evidence of deliberate structuring, and the complete absence of any acknowledgement or remorse from the defendant. She sentenced Brendan Voss to 7 years in a federal institution, plus restitution orders totaling $1.9 million to the investors, who could be traced and whose losses could be documented. The assault charge added 6 months consecutive. 7 years and 6 months. For a man who had built his identity around the assumption that consequences were for other people. I was in the courthouse parking lot when I got the text from Andrea. I sat in my car for a few minutes. The morning was gray and cold, a typical April in Ontario, and the parking lot was mostly empty. I read the text twice, put the phone in my jacket pocket, and drove home. Claire was in the kitchen when I came in, Daniel on her hip looking out the window at the backyard, where the first uncertain green of spring was beginning to show in the grass. She heard the door and turned, and she looked at my face and understood without my saying anything. She handed Daniel to me. He grabbed my collar with both hands, which is his current preferred way of asserting himself, and looked at me with the particular focused seriousness of a 7-month-old who has not yet developed the cognitive capacity for significance, but seems, somehow, to sense it anyway. Claire leaned her head against my shoulder. I've thought a lot, in the months since, about what happened in that school hallway, not Voss's action, but what came after it. The silence, the stillness, 3 adults within reach of my wife, and the seconds that passed before anyone moved. I don't say this to condemn those parents. Shock is real. The nervous system's hesitation in the face of sudden violence is documented, understood, physiologically explicable. They were not bad people. 2 of them, in fact, testified at the trial. One of them, a father named Glenn, told me afterward in the courthouse hallway that he'd thought about that moment every day since it happened, and that he was sorry. I told him the testimony had mattered. It had. But I think about the silence anyway, because I think it contains something worth sitting with. Not guilt, not blame, but a question worth asking. What would it mean to be the person who moves? I've come to believe, and this is perhaps the only lesson worth drawing from any of this, that the law is not a replacement for courage. The law did its work here, and I'm grateful for it. But the law begins after someone decides to move, to speak, to file a report, to make a phone call, to sit in a chair across from an investigator and tell the truth for 6 hours. The law is the structure. The people inside it are the ones who have to choose. Dennis Choi chose. He'd been choosing quietly, for years, keeping those files, waiting, not knowing if the moment would ever come. When it did, he didn't hesitate. The parents who testified chose. Glenn, who'd been frozen in that hallway, sat in a witness box and spoke clearly, and didn't minimize what he'd seen. Claire chose when she came home from the hospital that Tuesday evening and sat at our kitchen table and told me accurately, knowing me, "Don't do anything tonight." She gave me a day. She trusted me to know the difference between justice and reaction. I try to be worth that trust. Daniel is 18 months old now. He walks with the unsteady confidence of someone who has recently discovered that legs are a viable option and has committed fully to the project. He has an opinion about everything and the vocabulary to express approximately 12 words of it, which means a great deal gets communicated through tone and pointing. Claire goes back to school in September. Her class will have a new group of 5-year-olds, and she'll buy her own supplies and string leaves along the windows in October and cut out hearts in February, and some of those children will remember her for the rest of their lives without knowing why. I'll go back to closing arguments and early mornings and cold coffee, and the long, slow, necessary work of building cases that hold. I don't find this work glamorous. I don't think it's supposed to be. I think it's supposed to be careful. I think about a retired teacher from Hamilton who gets to sleep a little easier because the numbers on a restitution order have her name on them. I think about 41 other people in that same category. Imperfect, partial, but real. I think about a man in a federal institution who is, for the first time in a long time, in a room that doesn't care who he is. And I think about my son, who grabbed my collar with both hands the morning all of this concluded, and who looked at me with those serious, unhurried eyes, and who will grow up in a world where I am one of the people who try to make the structure hold. That will have to be enough. Most days it is. There's something I've come to believe after 11 years in courtrooms, and one September afternoon that changed everything. Arrogance is not strength. It never was. Arrogance is the performance that fills the space where genuine confidence is absent. Brendan Voss walked out of that school hallway believing that his money, his lawyers, his company's carefully structured paper trail had made him untouchable. He was wrong, not because I was clever or lucky, but because he had spent years treating people as objects and had never once stopped to ask himself who those people were when they left the room. Every person he dismissed was a person with a life, with connections, with a history he didn't know. Every silence he mistook for submission was something else entirely. The world is full of quiet people doing serious work. I'd encourage you to be careful about which ones you underestimate.